I am going to go ahead and transition us to our final panel of the day, final panel of the forum, actually. And I want to send a huge gratitude to Representative Debra Lekanoff for taking the lead on pulling together this amazing panel that you're about to experience. I really appreciate all of your work, Representative Lekanoff. Very excited about this session. Just a few words from me before I officially hand over the baton to you, Representative Lekanoff. So just bear with me for 1 second. I've asked throughout this forum for grace and patience as we manage the technical issues. It's gone pretty smoothly, but we've had a couple little hiccups related to this panel. So I just ask again for that grace and patience. For the presenters on this panel, I have 2 PowerPoints. I have Tom's and I have Tim's. If there are other PowerPoints that need to be shown, please get them to me somehow or other. I will be running the PowerPoints from my end. And then last but not least, this panel.
Am I here? Am I here?
You are, Ray.
Hello, welcome. You're here. Great.
Can you hear me, Patti?
Yep, we can hear you, Ray.
You're muted, Patti.
Yeah, Ray, I'm Hillary. Nice to meet you. I'm just finishing up kind of the handoff to Representative Lekanoff, and then you all are going to take it from there. And this is for you, Debra. At 1:40, I'm going to, or sorry, at 1:35, I'm going to give you a 5-minute warning. And then at 1:40, I'm going to come on and we'll need to have the panel end by 1:40. With that, it is my honor to hand the baton over to Representative Debra Lekanoff to introduce our esteemed panelists for this session. So Debra, take it away.
Great, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you to my Coast Salish family. It's been way too long since I've seen you all. We are sitting here in this time of a pandemic, in this time of crisis, but we as the Coast Salish people have never forgotten that taking care of the Salish Sea, protecting our environment, and making sure that we have a safe place for generations to come is just intertwined in every breath that we take. I'm going to pause here. We have an exciting agenda today. My friend, my mentor, my uncle, my dad, my brother, all wrapped up sometimes into one. Ray Harris is going to do welcome today. We're going to transition to Chief Leah George from Tsleil-Waututh Nation, who's going to speak to us about the implementation of the UN Declaration, the UNTRIP, into the provincial government. And then we're going to transition to listen and get a briefing from Carleen Thomas with Tsleil-Waututh Nation. I have a bug flying by, sorry you guys, with Carleen Thomas from Tsleil-Waututh Nation. And then we'll also hear from, let's see, we're Chief Dalton Silver. I think he might be joining in here. I'll check to make sure he can sign in, Hillary. And then from there, we're going to transition to Tim Brewer, the attorney from the Tulalip tribes, and to Tom Ehrlichman, who is an attorney with the Swinomish tribe, to talk about the work that we've been doing on treaties and transboundary dialogue. And then we're going to transition into Makah Nation, who is where Chad Bowechop, the newly elected councilman for Makah, will be sharing their engagement on transboundary. And I think you've heard from Chad in all 3 of these forums. And if you don't know Chad, he just carries a wonderful voice from the people who have treaty rights out on the ocean side. And then we're going to close with my friend, my mentor, my sister, my auntie, all wrapped up into one, Patti Gobin with the Tulalip tribes. The tribes that you'll hear from Tsleil-Waututh, from Swinomish, from Tulalip, from Jimenez, from Makah, we've all been part of this amazing journey of working together within the Salish Sea and then recognizing our families out on the ocean side from Makah down to Ho, Quinault, and Quileute. So with that, Ray, you are going to give us a warm welcome, and then we'll transition over to Chief Leah George. So Ray, it's all yours. So I'm gonna pause here and turn over to Chief Leah George Wilson. I've known Leah as long as I've known my Coast Salish family. I first came into Coast Salish territory 17 years ago with a brand new little baby. She is, my Emma is now 16, and I like to say, Leah, I've known you that long, and you've been a sister and a friend. Chief Leah George of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation has been intertwined within the Coast Salish territory from BC down to Washington tribes, where she has always received a warm welcome from her brothers and sisters to the south. She is a national and international leader who has worked across Canada throughout international countries, and she completely has been engaged. Okay, I'm going to work with Ray. And she's been completely engaged in the UNDRIP for many generations, for many years. So with that, Chief George, I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm going to put myself on mute, and I'm going to help Ray.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you to Debra and the organizers of this conference for inviting me onto this panel. Disclaimer, I am not everything that Debra has said. I'm actually pinch hitting for a friend of ours who wasn't able to join us for this presentation. So you're getting a pretty unvarnished presentation today and no PowerPoint, so I will try to be interesting. We wanted to talk about the British Columbia legislation that was passed in November 2019 called the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. We kind of call it DRIPA up here. And that came through with a discussion with the First Nations in British Columbia on how we could see the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People be affirmed in a provincial piece of legislation. And in 2019, there hadn't been any legislation passed at the federal level, although it was on the table. And that's the big purpose of this act, is to affirm the application of the declaration to the laws in British Columbia. So right away, they made a commitment to ensure that all of the laws, policies will be in line with the UN declaration. That's big. No one else has done it, and Canada has yet to do it. We're very happy about that, because also in the DRIPA in section 7, it talks about how they are the province for the purposes of reconciliation. The Lieutenant Governor and Council may authorize a member of the Executive Council on behalf of the government to negotiate and enter into an agreement with an Indigenous governing body relating to one or both of the following. So it gives them the opportunity to negotiate with First Nations in British Columbia and create these agreements. And we haven't had that kind of direct discussion. Before the DRIPA came along, of course, we had the UN Declaration, and we also have had case law, but even more important than that, we've had our own Indigenous legal orders. Our own Indigenous legal orders they originate from time immemorial. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is like 12 or so years old. The duty to consult, accommodate, and obtain consent has been recognized in Canadian law since Tsleil-Waututh, about 25 years. So this is having all of these tools with us is the way that we can advance consent in our territories using our laws and our own jurisdiction. So it looks like to us, DRIPA has kind of set the table for a consent-based future. We may well be in an era of mutual consent, and we've not been there before. So this declaration is this open-ended commitment to legally reform BC laws to be consistent with the UN Declaration. Its core components that the UNDRIP is applicable to laws of BC. There's a commitment to make all of BC laws consistent. There is an enabling section that I just spoke to you about, Section 7, that allows BC to negotiate consent-based government-to-government agreements. There is the commitment to an action plan, British Columbia and First Nations priorities for law reform. So there needs to be a discussion with the First Nations in British Columbia on what or how or which laws need to be reformed right away. And you know, that could be regulations on free, prior, and informed consent. That could be education. That could be LNG, mining, child welfare. It's education. It's everything. That action plan has not been drafted to date. In British Columbia, we have a First Nations Leadership Council. It's made up of the 3 provincial organizations in British Columbia. First Nations Summit, where Ray and I co-chair. They represent First Nations in the treaty process. The Union of BC Indian Chiefs represent First Nations who are sovereign. And in the BC Assembly of First Nations represents the BC section of the National Assembly of First Nations organization. Together, they form the First Nations Leadership Council and they don't negotiate on behalf of our people, but they're like the spokespeople, much like what Ray is going to do for us. And we're kind of doing it in a backwards kind of way, but I think just for the sake of time, we've opted to carry on in this way. There will be, back to the DRIPA, there will be annual reporting done to the legislature so you can see what progress or perhaps what progress hasn't taken place. There likely won't be any presentation or report this year because of COVID. There hasn't, BC and the First Nations haven't been able to get out to do the consultation that needs to be done with the First Nations in British Columbia. And the DRIPA actually speaks to Indigenous governing bodies. So that isn't necessarily the Indian bands under the Indian Act. It can be whatever the First Nation puts forward as their governing entity. In Canada, we're organized in Indian bands with the federal government, while in the United States, you're all in tribes. So we spoke a little bit about how old our own Indigenous legal orders are, and that the requirement for consent in common law has existed since, well, actually was given some punch to it in the Tsleil-Waututh when they went to the Supreme Court of Canada. So consent is a requirement in settled law for First Nations to establish Aboriginal title. Since 1997, that Stelgamuk that I was talking about, we have had seen the scope of duty to consult. So we can see from that consent is actually based in Canada's common law. This Declaration Act for British Columbia really silences the people that have said that free, prior, and informed consent is merely aspirational. It isn't. In British Columbia, with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, we see that it's in law. And that actually is in part of 2A in the purposes of the Declaration Act. It's really an exciting time for us. This action plan that First Nations will help work on with British Columbia will be a prioritization of legal reform subjects, and we don't really know what order people will consider. But for simple implementation, we would ask that all project approvals be subject to government discussions through free, prior, and informed consent and IBAs, impact and benefit agreements, and free, prior, and informed consent. It is an exciting time, and there are people that are going to think that it's not going to work. One of the things on the Indigenous side is that the Declaration Act may give rise to our own Indigenous legal orders to be as equal to common law statute and apply. And that's something that is really obviously important to our Indigenous people. We think that in our view, business industry will comply, will fall into line and figure out a way, because industry does that. It's all about business. So we think that between industry and the First Nations, they'll be able to figure it out, and we'll be able to continue on with the work that's being done or can be done in British Columbia. And this standard of people of our own free, prior, and informed consent, and using our own Indigenous laws and having it in a provincial act where the province has to ensure that its own laws and policies are in line with the UN Declaration is amazing. And it is a standard that everyone should be aspiring to. I unfortunately didn't look at the time when I started this, and I'm really anxious for us to get back to the appropriate order. I just want to end with this, is that the amount of legal reform that will be required to take place to ensure that all of the laws and policies are in line with the UN Declaration is incredible. What we need to think about is how can we strategically make that happen? In what kind of increment will that need to happen? On the Indigenous side, we certainly need to continue to be relentless in our advocacy to ensure that those pieces of legislation are brought in line. We already have consent. Consent is the norm, and we see that it's settled in Canadian common law. So everyone that's going to be at the table will be at the table to negotiate and achieve agreements, because nobody sits at the table to not make an agreement. So this area of mutual consent is here. And it could be that the duty to consult is kind of a blessing in disguise, given all the other things that are happening around us with the UN Declaration. And it will be good business to do deals. So industry will adapt. That's what industry does. It's impossible not to embrace the excitement and the enthusiasm of a new area. So we end up walking this line again, trying not to be too happy or too excited or too hopeful. And then on the other side, trying not to be too pragmatic or to doubt the things that are going to happen. In British Columbia, I think it was somebody from industry said that if the UN Declaration was ever affirmed in any piece of legislation in British Columbia, the sky would surely fall. Well, when the sky is clearing, it is not a time to fear that the sky is falling, because it isn't. Thank you.
Hey, I think Leah, it was so wonderful to see you. Thank you for joining us today. And we're so excited for the work that's happening in British Columbia, and how exciting for us to find perhaps a potential legislator down in Washington State who could work with you all to do the same across the Salish Sea. I might know a person or two. With that, I want to turn it over to Ray Harris. Ray, is your sound, can you hear us? You'll have to take it off mute.
unmuted.
There you are, my friend.
Good to hear you guys, ladies. So who am I talking to, Deborah?
So Ray, you have just about 100 attendees across Washington state. They are from the provincial, state, and local government and tribes and First Nations. They've all been working on how do we address transboundary response from a science, legal, and policy platform to protect the Salish Sea. They are the key staff people that have been incorporating, working together in a collaborative way to be able to protect this place we all love. That's your audience that you get to speak to today, and welcome.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Deborah. Thank everybody. Since we have 100 or so members or participants here working all in the same effort, I don't have much to say except to say thank you. I remember days when there was just a handful of us working at this effort. It was hurtful to know that when we attended meetings that we were the first attempts, we were ridiculed and put down a bit because we dared to speak up for the health of the Salish Sea. But now today, because of all the effort that's been put forward by many, some of us, some of our speakers have passed on, but now we have partners collaborating to help with the Salish Sea. I could say that I heard it described this way. We are still gathering wood. We're the wood carriers. We built a nice fire for all of us. People came to join the fire. Some even brought some wood to keep the fire going. It's now, I see it as efforts that we need to still carry and gather wood to keep this fire going. And I really appreciate the science policymakers, chiefs like Leah, all the chiefs, all the leaders from the nations that have went beyond and over the efforts to make sure the Salish Sea is going to go back to being a healthy place for us to enjoy, for our children to enjoy, and for all the partners and visitors that come to the Salish Sea to enjoy. On this side of the border, our license plate says beautiful British Columbia. For quite a while, though, that picture was a picture only. But now there's a lot of work being done. It's even prettier when the salmon are going up the little streams, brooks. Right now they're going, the chump salmon are returning. They're the most visible ones. They come for a month or 6 weeks. So if you go down to a creek or a little neighboring brook somewhere close to you, you might even see one or two or three. and they're turning up the sand, the gravel, making it livable for themselves. They're doing their part in keeping the ecology good enough so that they can lay their eggs and salmon will return. We am so thankful to hear that there's efforts being made. Thank you so much. Thank you, Deborah. And I'm packing lots of wood. So leaders like we have today don't have to worry about that kind of work because they're taking it now to another level, a level that is higher up in the governance issue. Government to government means a lot to us, and we hear it quite regularly. So we in Canada here in the north, Canada made a statement a couple of weeks ago that they're gonna, for the second or third time, that UN declaration is gonna be legislated. So we have to keep the fire stoked. Thank you so much, Debra and Leah and all, Patti. Thank all of you. I see Carly, good to see you. Awesome. Aichka.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you for sharing those good words with us. You know, it was 15 years ago that the Coast Salish Gathering, which was 44 BC Provincial First Nations and 20 Western Washington tribes met on the shoreline of Jamestown. And Billy Frank Jr. shared the same words you shared, Ray, that we're bringing kindling to the fire and we're keeping the fire going. And you'll hear that framework of conversations throughout Coast Salish territory. With keeping the fire going, I want to introduce Carleen Thomas with Tsleil-Waututh Nation. I've known Carleen almost as long as I've known her sister, Chief Leah George Wilson. She has been a warrior that's been intertwined in protecting the environment, protecting the culture, but doing it from a Coast Salish transboundary way. She is a grandmother, an auntie, a mom, and a friend. So Carleen, we've had, and we know you've been deeply intertwined within protecting your territory up there in Tsleil-Waututh Nation. And we want to be able to hear today, you know, what your experience has been as you faced the devastating oil spill up in Abbotsford, and how we can engage on a transboundary basis to intertwine federal conversations and provincial conversations. And what does that really mean for a nation such as yours with Aboriginal rights and inherent rights to that territory when it comes to these type of crises that impact our Salish Sea and our shorelines and our way of life. So Carleen, I turn it over to you.
Oh, hi, Deb. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to be here, speak a little bit about my experience and the work that I'm doing. I am from the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, and I currently represent an area called the Burrard Inlet Lower Fraser River region for the Indigenous Advisory Monitoring Committee for the Trans Mountain Project. So our committee is comprised of 13 Indigenous caucus members and 6 representatives from 6 federal ministries. Our work is really important in doing the monitoring of, so our mandate is to be able to monitor pre-construction, construction, post-construction of this project. We have worked really hard also to include marine shipping, and I was so happy to see and hear Christine present earlier, as she's part of our group as well. So we've all been working hard building this relationship with these ministries, and I think what's important to kind of point out from some of the presentations I've heard today is what we try and do is break down those silos, because even within departments, like say Fisheries and Oceans Canada, within their structure, they also have little silos and they all don't talk to each other. So when we're going to say do one of the monitoring aspects we do is we participate in compliance verification assessments. So it's basically an inspection of a terminal, or of with DFO, it's with the Westridge Marine Terminal. And there had been some incidents over the past year with fish kills. Herring had got caught in a section of their construction, and there was some mortality. So while we're on this call with DFO, asking them questions about, what, so the accident happened, it was reported, DFO did an assessment on it. So what are the next steps? Well, the folks on the call couldn't help us. We have to go to another section, and I forgive me, I can't remember what it's called, but it's another section within DFO that we have to go and get information about. What are the ramifications? What are the consequences for this proponent, for this accident happening on this in this project? So that's part of the work that we try and do. Debra referenced a spill that just happened recently. It was on land up at Tsleil-Waututh, and I don't want to speak for Chief Dalton. I hope he can make it in the door soon, but there was a pretty significant spill that happened in his backyard, and it has potential to really do some damage to their there's potentially archaeological sites there, and I understand that there's potential for the oil to go into the ground and find its way to the water table. To that services not just the Tsleil-Waututh people, but other people in the Abbotsford area. While we have a pretty good working relationship with SER, the Canada Energy Regulator, it took a lot of, I don't want to say arm twisting, but just pushing that button to say, hey, we need our Indigenous monitors there. The IMC needs our monitors on site while the company and the other folks in the area are responding to this spill. It took, I honestly don't know how many hours it took, but it took like a day or so, and it took a lot of pressure from our Indigenous leaders to ensure that we have Indigenous monitors on site. And I think it went fairly well. This is the first time that I'm aware of, well, specific to this project, that we had Indigenous monitors on site working alongside the Canada Energy Regulator and the Tsleil-Waututh and the Stalo people. We have a lot of work to do. We have a long way to go. Again, it's just about breaking down those silos, in ensuring that Indigenous knowledge keepers and Indigenous experts are at tables that are making decisions about how to protect, respond, plan to protect our lands and waters from these types of incidents that will happen. It's not a question of if a spill happens, it's a question of when. So with that, I'm not too sure if I can add anything more. As I said, I hope Chief Silver will be able to make it to the call, and I will just look for questions in the Q&A section. Deb?
Carlene, thank you so much. And there's some lessons to be learned, definitely from what Carlene has shared. And we're also going to follow up with a conversation with Chief Dalton Silver, and we'll be able to send that out to Hillary, and he'll be able to share his story. I'm going to turn it over now to our Western Washington panel. I'd like to introduce Tim Brewer, who's got, over 25 years worth of experience in protecting treaty rights, not only for the Tulalip tribe, but in collaboration with Washington tribes across the state, and then in collaboration with our international friends to the north. So Tim, I'll turn it over to you, and then I'll have you introduce Tom Ehrlichman.
Thank you, Debra. I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in this Shared Waters Forum to discuss the Native perspective on protecting the Salish Sea. Debra, I did have a PowerPoint. Is that something that's going to be available for my talk?
Caleb and Hillary, there you go.
All right, great. So yes, I'm going to talk about some of the legal sources of law that protect Native rights on the US side of the border. There are a number of sources of law involved with Native rights in the Salish Sea. In Canada, you have Aboriginal rights protections as well as treaty rights protections and strong duties to consult, and then, as was discussed earlier, consent. In the US, treaties have been the most important source of tribal rights and authorities in the Salish Sea. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to go over a few basic principles. I'm going to talk about treaty rights, and then I'm going to turn it over to Tom Ehrlichman, who's going to talk about tribes that have treaty rights and are located on the Salish Sea, being involved in different projects involving vessel traffic in Canada and the US as those impact the exercise of treaty rights. So a few basic principles. The Indian tribes in the United States were recognized as sovereign governments with inherent powers that predated the border between the United States and Canada. The United States entered into treaties with the sovereign tribal nations. Treaties are contracts between sovereign nations, and the United States Constitution recognizes treaties to be the supreme law of the land, and they take precedence over any laws of the state of Washington. The tribes are all individual governments recognized by the United States with their own legal systems, their own constitutions. That sovereignty is still subject to the sovereignty of the United States federal government. It's been described in federal court cases as the federal government has plenary power. However, the federal government does have to exercise that power with the acknowledgement that it has a trust responsibility, of a fiduciary responsibility to protect tribal resources. Next slide, please. There are at least 15 federally recognized tribes that have reserved treaty rights in all of the waters, tidelands, and shorelines on the US side of the Salish Sea. There is often some fairly good competition between the tribes as far as fishing goes, but there has been an enormous degree of solidarity on the US side and with relatives north of the border on protection of the environment of the Salish Sea. Next slide. The treaties at issue in Washington state were the so-called Stevens treaties that were negotiated in the mid-1800s. Those treaties are a mixed bag for the tribes, in that those treaties did cede millions of acres of Indian land to the United States. But in doing that, the tribes did reserve, very importantly to the tribes, the right to continue their lifeways and the exercise of rights in how they survive, which is fishing, shellfishing, hunting, and gathering. They were important in the 1800s, and they're still very important today. Those rights that were negotiated in the treaties in the 1850s, they were not fully recognized by the state of Washington. I would say continuously violated by the state of Washington for decades. And it really wasn't until the 1970s when you had tribal leadership standing up. You had people like Billy Frank, Stan Jones, and many others going out fishing in spite of the fact that Washington state said it was illegal, and eventually leading to very important federal court cases which established and recognized the treaty rights of tribes in the Salish Sea and to fish for salmon. Next. Yeah, it really can't be overstated how important the right to fish was to the tribes back then and today. It was an essential component of the treaty. The federal courts, as far back as the early 1900s, did recognize that the right to resort to fishing places that were in controversy and always have been were part of the larger rights possessed by the Indians, upon the exercise of which there was not a shadow of impediment. The treaty was not a grant of rights to the Indians. There was no grant of right to the Indians to fish, but the treaties actually granted rights away. The many acres of land that were granted away, but everything that wasn't granted away was reserved by the tribes. And most importantly, the right to continue their culture and their subsistence, and their right to continue to fish to support their families. Next, please. So the Bolt decision has been litigation that was from the 1970s. It's been going on for 40 years. It's the longest running court case, I believe, in US history. It's still going on today. There are literally been hundreds and hundreds of issues decided in the context of this case. But I'm going to just hit a few of the basic principles. One of the main principles is an equitable share of the fish. The tribes are entitled to 50% of the available harvest at the usual and accustomed fishing grounds of the tribes. There is also a geographical aspect to the treaty rights that were reserved. Each tribe reserved the right to continue fishing in their usual and accustomed areas. That is, all the areas that they fished at treaty time, we're talking the 1800s, were reserved in the treaty. And that is why all of the Salish Sea on the US side of the border is subject to reserved treaty rights. Next. Treaty rights have been recognized by the federal courts as a form of property rights. Property rights protected under treaty, and the state cannot take those rights. The federal government, although there is authority to take those rights, there is also then the obligation to pay just compensation if those rights are taken. Next. So just to summarize some of the important aspects of treaty rights that relate to the issues you all are discussing, which are activities in the Salish Sea, such as increased vessel traffic and increased risk of oil spill. The federal court decisions indicate that there is a protection. The treaty rights can carry a protection against degradation of treaty resources, i.e. salmon, other fish, finfish, shellfish. There is also protection against displacement from access to usual and accustomed fishing places. And there's protection of the waters that salmon depend on. That is, there are rights to in-stream flows of rivers that support salmon runs. Next. You all are here today. You all know that the Salish Sea is in jeopardy today. We've got keystone species such as the Chinook and the steelhead that are listed as threatened across the Puget Sound in the United States. They're listed under the Endangered Species Act, same with the southern resident orca. Pollution and habitat degradation have taken its toll on the marine environment. And the one not listed here is the elephant in the room, climate change and the effect it's having on the marine ecosystem. All of these things together are raising huge concerns with the Native people that I have been working with, and finally starting to raise concerns in the wider society. Next, please. So treaty and habitat degradation, again, as part of the treaty right, recently decided case, a huge milestone case, I would say, which is the Culvert case, which went all the way to the US Supreme Court and affirmed the principle that the treaties carry a duty to refrain from degrading or authorizing others to degrade fish habitat or fish passage in a manner that jeopardizes the fish populations that are protected under treaty and which tribes depend on. A very important principle, and one that tribes are going to be relying on in many instances going forward. Next, please. The right of access, again, there was a case out of Lummi in which a fish pen was in a permit process. It would have taken 11 acres of area waters in the usual and accustomed fishing area of the Lummi Nation. The Lummi disputed that in court, and the court said, yes, taking 11 acres of waters out of a treaty reserved fishing area is a treaty violation, and it could not go forward. So again, another substantive limitation on development that treaty rights carry. Next. Here's just a list of the different types of development activities and other activities that can impact Western Washington treaty rights. The two I have in red are ones that are relevant to this forum today: shoreline terminal development and shipping and anchoring. Both of those can displace tribal fishermen and also interfere with tribal fishing. Next. The reserve treaty rights predate the full establishment of the US-Canadian border and the establishment of the international shipping lanes. The US tribes have a right to fish in the international shipping lanes, and they often exercise that right. That does, however, create conflict with ship navigation. Next. The types of impacts to the exercise of tribal treaty fishing rights are direct interference when ships are coming through and tribal members are forced to quickly pull up nets and try to avoid collision. There is gear loss, and there's also increased risk of oil spills from these conflicts. Next. Are we? I just want to touch finally on some cross-border issues, since this is a shared water forum.
Tim, sorry, I hit a little technical snafu. Bear with me, I'll get it back.
All right, no problem. So anyway, I always like to remind myself of the close connection between all the Salish tribes who knew no border for over 1,000 years. And there's a huge amount of interconnection, relations and friendships that are certainly current and go back many generations. And again, there's a lot of solidarity between the tribes in protecting the Salish Sea. So tribes have been looking much more so at collaboration across borders and looking at sources of law that will help tribes work together to take on these threats from more development, more terminals, increased large vessel traffic, increased tanker traffic. There's the two projects that have very much gotten the tribe's attention in the US, as well as obviously Canada, where these projects are located in the traditional territories. Yeah, could we flip through a couple slides here? Yeah, that's fine. So Roberts Bank is one which Tom is going to talk about, which is located, I think, just like a mile north of the international border. The other, obviously, is the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which would significantly increase oil tanker traffic through the shipping lanes that go right along the border. Huge concerns for tribes in the US, and the tribes have participated and gone and testified in Canada about those impacts. And we're somewhat heartened to see in the review panel that there was some acknowledgement that there was going to be a transboundary effect, and that would affect US tribes. So I see this continuing. And again, Tom is going to talk more about that. Next. This was talked about earlier in this panel, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, and clearly there are provisions here as well for recognizing the rights of Indigenous people across borders. We're really, again, heartened to see British Columbia legislate to give effect to this declaration. The US has supported it under the Obama administration. It has not, however, passed the Senate in the US. And we're hoping for a change in November so that the US can, again, provide more support for these important principles. And then last, I just want to touch on this case, which I was able to watch a little bit of the arguments on the internet earlier this week, the Queen versus Disotell case. Not directly on point here, but very interesting as far as cross-border Aboriginal rights go in Canada under Canadian law. I've been talking about US law, but this actually was a case involving the Arrow Lakes Band that are located in north central Washington, who have extensive Aboriginal territory in Canada, and a recognition by at least the Court of Appeals there that Aboriginal occupation in Canada gave rights to the rights of the Arrow Lakes people living in the US under Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution. The Supreme Court of Canada will be deciding this soon, I would imagine. And we're certainly going to be looking at that. It's an important case, and it could potentially have ramifications for consultation and, again, increased involvement under Canadian law for tribes that straddle the border with Canada. That's all I have, and thank you very much. Do we have Tom next? Debra, are you there?
Tom here. I think she had provided you, Tim, with the authority to hand off the baton to me.
Authority, but without the technical expertise.
So I'll jump in here then. Thank you, Tim. That was really an interesting talk, and that case is one that I'm interested to learn more about and to watch as well. My name is Tom Ehrlichman, and I'm special counsel to the Swinomish Indian tribal community. and very pleased to be talking with you all today. If we could go back to my first slide there, I'd appreciate that. I've got a PowerPoint that I'm going to whiz through in the interest of time, but will be a part of the record that is this conference, so folks can go back and read at their leisure. But I'll try to orient you as to why slides are there. I want to start off just by saying that I found this conference very interesting. The themes seem to be, lessons learned in the last 3 years, looking forward, where do we go from here? And I was really interested to hear Dr. Norman and the way that she talked about framing a mental construct. How do we look at the world of interference in shared waters in the Salish Sea? It is about framing a mental construct that we can all use to then, for common ground, to discuss policy and risk management. We've entered a phase here, I think Debra alluded to this, and Ray, Chief Harris, that we're no longer in a tussle of separate interest groups or governments or sovereigns. We're working together today. There's a much better communication and dialogue, and that mental construct has been taking shape. So I'd like to focus on that a bit today. If we could go to my next slide here. I think in our discussions and in these kinds of conferences, we tend to try to reinvent the wheel. We try to think our way through when actually so much of the work has already been done, in my opinion, based on the research I've done the last couple of years. And I am by no means a scholar of international law. And the United Nations is not a governing body over sovereign nations. On the other hand, it has been an effective forum for bringing together the best minds of the world and all peoples of the world to think about how we move forward. And I've listed here some of the tremendous writings that have come out of that international discussion. And they've been adopted by consensus as conventions of international norms. And what I'm seeing is that the things that we've been talking about in this conference all fit within those statements, within those norms. And that's what we're striving for, is how do we implement basic norms of human decency and right in environmental protection? And in these UN declarations, we see that it isn't just a matter of environmental protection. Us Westerners, we tend to sort of break things into categories. There's environmental protection over here, there's culture over here, there's history over here. And what we have learned, I think, listening to our First Nations and tribal leadership here, is that there's another way of looking at all of this. And that combines all of those concepts. And so what we have in these UN statements is an effort to try to bring together that way of looking at things. And when we do that in the context of the Salish Sea and shared waters, we have the ability to have a discussion about rights. It is not just a matter of sharing the water. There isn't, in my way of thinking as a lawyer, there isn't a right for any one person, company, government to use the resource to the maximum extent that they want to use it. Instead, there are norms as to how we're going to use it together. And so I strongly encourage folks, if you only read one document in this long PowerPoint, to take a look at the Convention on Environmental Impact Assessment in a transboundary context. This was adopted way back in '91 and is still absolutely relevant today. Let's go to the next slide and just kind of click through the next series of slides. But this is a fabulous document that sums up, again, I think most of the concepts and mental constructs that we are hearing in this conference. And as we go down and click down in the appendices, they've even listed, let's go back up to that one. they've even listed the kinds of activities that should be subject to these principles. And obviously ports, transit or shipment centers are one of those. Let's keep going down. And then they go through and they list the kinds of things that governments could enter into as side agreements to address environmental issues. We could go to the next slide. Interestingly, Canada's environmental protection statute embraces those principles. Again, not reinventing the wheel, but bringing into Canadian law one of the basic norms or human principles of human conduct, which is that you look across to your neighbor when you're evaluating the impact of your own action. And in the Canadian statute, it requires Canada to look beyond the Canadian border. We go to the next slide. As Tim mentioned, our US treaty tribes with usual and custom fishing areas that extend to the Canadian border have been actively appearing in Canadian forums to address that principle. And Swinomish and other tribes appeared in front of the environmental assessment agency that was the impact assessment registry that was the agency of Canada, excuse me, the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada that was evaluating the Roberts Bank 2 terminal. Next slide. We've appeared before the NEB in the Trans Mountain pipeline case, including bringing forward scientific analysis of the impacts on our treaty fishermen across the border. Next slide. And when we bring these this evidence and this testimony to the Canadian reviewers, we're really addressing two general concepts that are the same concepts that we address here with the US agencies and private companies. And as Tim described, the treaty right really involves protection from physical interference or loss of access to the treaty reserved usual and accustomed fishing area. It also protects against environmental degradation that would eliminate the very resource that is the basis for the exercise of that treaty right. So those are the two mental constructs that our presentations and messages revolve around. We go to the next slide, please. So what are we talking about here? I'll briefly go through some of the things that you see in our testimony at the hearings and our letters frequently. We have tribal fishermen out on the water. Let's kind of click through these slides about 5 minutes. That shipping has on our tribal fishermen. You can see the hot zones, if you will, of where there is collision risk for treaty fishermen with tanker traffic. Next slide. You can see where there's the highest disruption of fishing across all of the different catch types for one given year. And you see there in the red zones, let's go to the next slide. The red zone there are the ones that Senator Williams talked about for the Swinomish tribe, of particular concern near Vendovi Island, Anacortes, and that enters to Rosario Strait. Next slide. We have had a good analysis done of the likelihood of these kinds of collisions or interruptions. And you can see again the hot zones here. Next slide. Overall, there has been an increasing trend of interference with our tribal fishermen. And this represents interference with the Dungeness crab fishery, where there's been a 50% increase over an 8-year period. And that is an upward trend that is not supportable for our Coast Salish people, their culture and their lifeways. Next slide, please. In addition to the physical interference direct from the vessels, we have our anchorage use, which has gone up. And an anchorage isn't just a dot, as you can see. It involves 11 football fields or more of territory taken out of an area where a tribal fisherman could set his net because the wind shifts, the tides change, and the ships swing. Next slide. And we have these hot spots in the middle of just key fishing areas, crab and salmon for our Swinomish fishermen. That's why we're here. That's why we appear at these proceedings and oppose the Trans Mountain Pipeline and oppose Roberts Bank too. Let's jump into those projects quickly with some basic facts to refresh. Next slide. Trans Mountain Pipeline obviously is sending tankers through the San Juans, again, prime fishing areas. Next slide. Under the applicant's information, we know that there will be an increase of 29 tankers a month, which is 348 a year. That times 2 is 696 tanker transits per year increase from 120 per year. So tribal fishermen will now have to calculate and confront 816 tanker transits per year, which brings the flow into the San Juans in our UNA to over 2 tankers every single day of the year. And then if we look at the shared waters concept in that context, or that mental construct, as a lawyer and as a citizen, one asks, is that a fair treatment of those who've had and have a property right in use of that resource, if it's sure to diminish the exercise of that right? And I would submit in this talk that it's more than a question of fair treatment. It's a question of the violation of the very right that Tim Brewer described for us in detail. And I submit further that it is a violation of a human right under the conventions, the international conventions that have been discussed in this conference. Let's keep going. Roberts Bank, quickly. The applicant says that they will be increasing vessel movements by 692 per year. So you combine those two projects and you can see why we are concerned and why we are engaging and working with you all to try to come to some better understanding of how to share the waterway. Let's keep going here in the interest of time. I just need to note that on the question of physical interference with the right, it's more than just the ship transits and the direct ship involvement or collision with the tribal fishermen. There's also dozens of tankers, support vessels, crew vessels, and then also the barges necessary to refuel those ships. And then their use of the anchorages for refueling and other purposes. So it's a compounding that is not insignificant at all. Let's spend a moment on the other second general construct that we present in these hearings, environmental harm. If the resource is to survive that is the underpinning of exercise of the right, then we need to take a look at not only the oil spill risk, but also the contingency planning. And we have tended to focus on the consequences of a direct spill. But lately we have been paying attention to the oil spill modeling that tries to estimate how much oil gets cleaned up once there is a spill, because our tribal leaders have told us that you go into this conversation not with if, but when there is a spill, despite best intentions, despite best planning, despite all the money that goes into it, when there is a spill sometime in the next 7 generations, what's going to happen? And understandably in these conferences, there is optimism expressed by some that our oil contingency recovery contingency planning is robust and will be able to handle a problem. But if you read the studies by the scientists on the oil spill modeling, the recovery modeling, that's not exactly what they say. Next slide. Let's click down a couple. Those are your Roberts Bank illustrations. Sorry, will you back up one to that last one on Roberts Bank? I just wanted to show you the plume from the Fraser River and put not a footnote, but a giant note in that this is where all of the sockeye salmon go that our US tribes depend on. They're swimming up into this lighter water up here, right past where the new terminal is going to be. Okay, thank you. Let's click down a couple of slides. Back up one. please. The Trans Mountain Pipeline, can you back up, fake? In 2015 was a extensive study conducted for Tsleil-Waututh, and we thank Tsleil-Waututh from the bottom of our hearts for the resources you have put into putting together the science on this. Next slide. What NUCA found was that between 36% and 63% of the oil would remain from a spill of the size they looked at, would remain on the water after 3 days, depending on seasonal weather and sea conditions. And you can see the black percentages there. That is oil remaining on the water after 72 hours. Next slide. And they stated in their key findings that, next slide, that the estimate there is not even accurate because it doesn't take into account trying to clean up or the amount of oil that goes onto the shoreline. And as you know, in some of these narrow passages, an oil spill, the oil gets on the shoreline within an hour or two, depending on wind and tide. So it's a very conservative estimate, but because of the conditions in certain locations, they estimated that we could be looking at 2/3 of the oil still being on the water after 3 days. And at that point, very difficult to capture. Next slide. And their analysis, it echoes, if we can go down another slide, echoes the same conclusion reached by Dagmar Schmidt-Etkin and Linda Pilkey-Jarvis and Applied Science Associates in 2005 when they did a study for ecology, next slide, on oil spill recovery in a spill of, I believe, 65,000 gallons in Rosario Strait. And this is particularly relevant to us today now that we have ship traffic carrying oil routed through Rosario. They also found that while the modeling that they did showed some good results in terms of oil cleanup, when they adjusted the model to match what they saw as more realistic results in the field, next slide, they found that between 8 to 24% of the oil was recovered, burned, or dispersed. 8 to 24%. Granted, maybe since 2005, we have put together a completely new program that is much more robust and moves that needle to what, 40%, 50%? That is still too much. That is more than can be sustained if what you are trying to do is to preserve the right of Indigenous people to continue to exercise the right that they've had for millennia. Let's go to the next slide. So I come back to what are the rules, the principles, what is the mental construct that the tribes and First Nations are trying to present to the world here in the Salish Sea. And it is amazing to be a part of this conference, this go around, to hear the First Nations speaking about the advances made in British Columbia to embrace the UN declarations and principles of international law that are grounded on protecting the dignity and the viability of Indigenous people. And we have a lot of work to do here in our state and in our region on the US side of the border to catch up. And we, as Tim said, we may have an opportunity to do that with our Senate coming forward. But even if not, the state of Washington can take steps just as the province of BC did to embrace those same principles, whether or not the conventions are ratified. Next slide, please. So I want to close by making sure that we are expressing our gratitude for the hard work, the dedication, the sincerity of those folks working in the industry, in the agencies, federal, state, and local, in the NGOs, who are tirelessly dedicated to making sure a spill doesn't happen and being ready to clean one up immediately if it can be done when it happens. But we challenge, I think, ourselves here now today to go further than that and to think about what's the right thing to do in terms of use of the Salish Sea on a cumulative basis? What is the total picture? Senator Williams gave a talk earlier today where he said, one of the problems in our governance is that we review things project by project. And that is, again, a very Western way of approaching things. Let's take this box and look at this, just this category, this box. And what we need desperately is a view of all of the projects together. What is their impact on the other people sharing the water, so that we are protecting the rights of all going forward from here? That's the only way we're going to make it as a community. And we really appreciate the time that you all are spending reflecting on this. Thank you for listening. Be happy to answer questions with the other panelists at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. I've got Dennis, I'm going to introduce someone. I'm going to put myself on mute. I'll be right back. Hi, I really want to just take a moment and thank Tom. I've known him also for many years. His experience on vessel traffic and oil transportation goes all the way back to us facing 9 coal terminals out here in the Northwest. The work that we've done with all of you in the governing bodies has been extraordinary, and I'm so thankful for the information that both him and Tim shared. With that, we have Dalton Silver on the phone. Dalton, are you on Zoom? Are you with us? Let me see. Dalton, you might have to turn your camera on and you're mute. There you are, Chief. So Dalton Silver is a great friend, a brother and uncle to me also. He met me when 17 years ago in Paquachin over on Vancouver Island, where I met Leah and Ray Harris. And here I was carrying a brand new baby, coming into my first meeting to learn about the Salish Sea. Dalton is a chief of Swinomish Nation. He has led many conversations on transboundary vessel traffic, protection of our culture, protection of the salmon, protection of the places that his people have called home all throughout the Fraser River. Dalton, you have had an extraordinary experience also, as Carleen from Tsleil-Waututh did, on the Abbotsford spill, and learning and understanding the consultation process improvements that could be done at the federal level, and then what was learned at the state level. Carleen covered a little bit of that today. I just thought with your, 17 years plus of leadership as a chief and as a friend and as a warrior of the Salish Sea, you could share a few words with us. I'll turn it over to you, my friend.
Thank you, Debra, and I want to say thanks to the organizers for including us, and apologies for my lateness. I had some problems with technology and trying to get connected. I was getting messages, and I want to, thank the rest of the Coast Salish presenters, the Indigenous presenters, for taking the time to do this. I think the Salish Sea is very important to all of us as Salish people and Coast Salish people. The experiences that Debra talked about that I've had of late were actually started in June. I think it was the 12th of June. In the middle of the night, I got a message. Of course, I didn't see till very early in the morning that there was a leak in the Sumas pump station of the Trans Mountain pipeline, which is a bit over a mile, maybe a mile and a little bit from where I'm sitting right now, across the Trans-Canada Highway. Of course, we were quite alarmed, and others got a hold of me right away, and we were in touch with Trans Mountain, and basically we've had involvement in the cleanup of the spill, and the spill was first reported at so many liters or so many barrels, which didn't seem a whole lot, but then considering where it was, it seemed a lot more. But anyway, the last estimate I've had is around 190,000 liters, which would say a little over 1,100 barrels of oil in an area that is very sensitive to our people, and that it's in the area of what was once Sumas Lake. So connected to a lot of our waterways, the area, and most importantly, our aquifer that we draw our drinking water sits below this, directly below. So it was a big concern, and I really have to say I've been fairly disappointed with a lot of the outcomes, and our involvement has more or less been we pushed our way in and said, hey, you know, it's to us it's our tribal territories. The uniqueness of it is that we have no agreement whatsoever with any government entities over the title of our tribal lands, and so as such we feel that we need to have a say in decisions that are made, especially those that will be affecting our environment. And I see, you know, in talking on this forum that we talk about shared waters, and I think that's one of the most important things, of utmost importance to our people, is the waters. And the water, as we know, gives life to everything around us. I hear that Carlene spoke earlier, and I'm glad she's a member of a Indigenous monitoring and advisory committee to do with the expansion proposal for the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and I'm glad to have her in there, and that others I've talked with, I said, look, we have someone there that's on our side, is on the side of environment, and she's in there doing the best she can to protect what's important to all of us. We had some involvement from those within the committee right from the onset, but it seemed evident as we went on that it was getting harder and harder to get information from the federal government and from their agencies, and that Trans Mountain Pipeline is now owned by the government of Canada, and even members of the provincial Ministry of Environment, and those technicians that appeared on site were having trouble getting information. It seemed really tough to get information through the federal government. I was able to get a very good friend of mine who worked previously with the Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Council as the vice president, and now works in environment and in negotiations, and has done some work with Sumas. I'll have to acknowledge Dr. Michelle Corfield, who came right away when she found out about the spill, and some others, technicians we've had who have been involved in oil spills, in the cleanup and investigations in places like Oklahoma, Saudi Arabia, Alberta, and other places. And as such, we've had the technology. We're with the Stalo peoples and our People River Referrals Office and the Stalo Research and Resource Management Center, the expertise there that has been built up over the years, we put all to use, and they've been a great help with environment techs, with engineers and others. We've actually offered from our team some advice as to how to clean up what's happened there. And one of the disappointments I talked about was that on the first day of the visit to the spill site, it became evident that the company itself was concentrating mainly on the area of the pump itself, on the cleanup. And though the oil had spilled over into an adjoining field that I noticed right away, and that looking at the vegetation, I knew it was a bit of a swampy area in that field, and the oil smell there was so strong. I told them right away that as far as we're concerned, we would hope you would start there in that field, and that we're worried about the water table. But as it were, they didn't start cleaning up the field for 5 days. And then the three test wells that they dug with an excavator, 2 of them showed contamination, and they hit the water table at 2 meters or about 6 feet underground. They started hitting the water table. So it's still a big worry to us. Official reports will say that the cleanup is done, but our technicians, our engineers are still on site weekly. We have monitors on site that we really had to push for to get Indigenous monitors to be there during the cleanup. About 2.5 weeks ago, they did find a lot more oil underneath the pumps that they thought had been cleaned up, and our engineers were on site to take some pictures. So it was like another small pond under there. So that, I think, would add to the 190,000 liters that was estimated to be spilled on that site. And, you know, we're talking shared waters. I have been in contact with a hydrogeologist from Environment Canada, who did also connect our engineers with a professor from one of the local universities, who have a great understanding of the Abbotsford Sumas Aquifer, which is where we draw our drinking water, and many others into Whatcom County and local townships draw their drinking water from there. I think it's a big worry, as the cumulative effects of what has happened here are not known. And I've mentioned before, there have been since 2005 that I know of, there have been 4 spills right in the immediate area that have affected the creeks and wetlands in the Sumas territory. And as such, I think the cumulative effects I'm talking about, where we live, everything will eventually reach the Salish Sea, us at Sumas being, I think, around 50 miles or so from the Salish Sea, and even closer to the Fraser River. But we're working on trying to get the company involved to finance. They have financed our involvement and our technicians being involved in the cleanup. But and I talked about the Indigenous Advisory and Monitoring Committee, and I really, really welcome their involvement. But it was pointed out after that their terms of reference go to the expansion proposal, whereby what we're dealing with now is the existing line. And I think, you know, the evidence we have about the existing line leads to a lot of worry about them expanding on this line. And I say I really thank those with the provincial government, the technicians and others, the Minister Heyman, who reached out to us as well from the provincial government, and in helping us trying to get answers from the federal government. It would seem that our engineers and technicians on the ground, actually working on site and monitoring on site with those working for the government and the company technicians, seem to get more answers than we would from a political level. And I really think that it needs to be stressed that in instances like this, people talk about jurisdictions and who's responsible for this and who's responsible for that, and levels of government. And it would seem there are formulated answers that come from the political representatives that I think, you know, are better portrayed from technician to technician, where the real facts are found out there. And I think that people need to realize, when we're looking after things such as this and we're talking about environment, we can't let your jurisdictions and levels of government and things like that get in the way when we're talking about protecting the environment. And I think there are so many answers I think that we still need. We have a big worry about the cumulative effects. The oil is still in the ground right now as we speak, contaminating the Sumas territory. And I believe the level of involvement from a lot of people should be a lot higher as far as looking after our environment and the protection of water, not just for ourselves, but for everything else out there. I'm really thankful for the time on the agenda, and I think I want to raise my hands to all of you. Everybody there I know has the concern with the environment, and I'm hoping that that ears and eyes were open when our Indigenous reps were speaking, so that our perspectives will be involved in further management of the resources and in looking after our environment.
Thank you, Chief. Thanks for sharing those good words. It's always good to see you, my friend.
Good to see
Next year,
you.
hopefully, we'll have some fish and we'll do some wind dried. That'll be the best. Wind dried from the Fraser is the best fish in the world, except from fish from Yakutat, of course.
Yeah.
Well, we're running behind time. My apologies, Hillary. But I really want to honor Councilman Bowechop in the years of experience that he's brought to the transboundary discussion on the ocean side, as those ships pass by his front yard for his lifetime. Chad, I don't know if you're there still. Maybe if we can turn your camera on. Oh, there you are. Oh, I lost him. Can you maybe say a few words, Chad, and you'll pop up here in the main screen. Chad Bowechop has been an extraordinary leader on a transboundary basis in developing relationships, not only with the governing bodies at the federal level for both governments, but also the province and Washington State. But he also has expanded his relationship into working with industry. Chad, we really value your input that you're able to provide here today. We have, when the Coast Salish Gathering first was held in Jamestown, it was the chief, the chairman, Ben Johnson from Makah, who sat at the table with the Coast Salish, and he reminded us that our water lines touch, our trees touch, and our people touch. And I remember him, Chad, he had the most eloquent words to share with us as he brought the Makah people to the table with grace, with kindness, and with respect to the place where so many generations of names have been intertwined within the waterways. So I don't know if you can, I don't see him, Caleb, and I'm not quite sure if he needs to take himself off mute and start speaking for him to pop on. There he is. There's Chad. It's good to see you, my friend.
It's good to see you as well, and thank you for the kind introduction.
Yes, sir.
It is my pleasure and privilege to share our working experience via this conference. We recognize we've had over 3 million gallons of oil spilled in our treaty area, and that prompted the Makah Tribal Council to understand we needed to create the means to address these issues. We made the conscious decision to base our fundamental approach on expressing our cultural and our spiritual values first. That's how we signed the treaty. We reserved that right unto ourselves to retain our cultural identity based on our spiritual values. And in order that our other partners at the international, federal, state, and provincial levels understand where we need to initiate our conversation to address shipping safety issues and oil pollution issues. The starting point is recognizing the Makah Tribal Council, the Makah Indian tribe, as indigenous to the Cape Flattery region for some studies have up to 20,000 years. We do know that coming down the coast pre-contact, you had to get permission from Chief McQuina up north around Tofino. Then you had to get permission from Chief Patouche, and then you entered into the Salish Sea as you went north. And forgive me for not remembering, I could guess, but I wouldn't want to start an argument in regards to the Salish chiefs that you had to gain permission from. what we're able to present through years of experience is, first of all, we represent our cultural interests based on our spiritual values. That's how we define who we are. And what that provides us the means then is to how to develop that fundamental understanding of to recognize the need to align our appropriate authorities. That's at the international level, that's at the US and Canadian federal government level, that's at the provincial and state level. And to me, when you speak to inherent sovereign authority, that begins to express the understanding of these waterways have been exercised as a highway, as a marine highway by First Nations of Canada and Washington tribes for many thousands of years. And that's what we base our investment into these issues, such as shipping safety and oil pollution. We determined from the beginning it's critical to be able to develop an understanding of how you align these authorities. Who do you speak to formally in order to get that reply that you're able then to bring back to your tribal council and your tribal people? At Makah, we're firm believers in trust responsibility isn't completely implemented until the Makah Tribal Council is able to deliver results of discussions and negotiations with the federal government to our tribal membership, to the tribal general council. Part of what we've come to understand as a fundamental need is multifaceted. We need to develop the governing capacity to be able to interact at an effective and an efficient manner with the federal government. And there are any number of federal departments and agencies that have trust responsibility to our well-being in regards to protecting the environment from oil pollution. We've worked closely in the past with Dale Jensen and the Spills program, attempting to set up the formal recognition of the need to implement multi-departmental and multi-party government-to-government consultation in order that trust responsibility can be adequately recognized, let alone adequately addressed via implementation. What we clearly have understood through working with our close cousins in the Salish Sea, Tulalip and Swinomish and Lummi and Quinault on the coast, is that meaningful consultation isn't meaningful unless there is, in fact, implementation. Tribal governments are tasked with working with federal and state governing agencies on multi-levels. We had a discussion with Admiral Gerard from the Canadian Coast Guard who approached us and asked us to assist them in heightening their understanding of what it is to work with tribal governments in regards to building oil spill response programs. And our reply to him was he approached us at a change of command at District 13, and we expressed interest based on his answer to a couple of questions. His offer was based through the CAN-US PAC and the Joint Response Team, but also it was based on the Canadian Ocean Protection Plan. And so we asked him and indicated to him we would have an interest if he would acknowledge his request to be based on capacity building. And he replied with the affirmative, yes, sir, Mr. Bowechop. So we further asked if you can recognize this work as capacity building at the transboundary level, or more particularly aimed at the First Nations of Canada, is there a funding source? And he said, yes, sir, Mr. Bowechop, the Canadian Ocean Protection Plan. So what that is an example of is, how do we define the framework of our working relationships with our partners? We were invited by Admiral Gerard to contribute to the Strait-of-Waututh Integrated Spill Response Plan. Now, having acknowledged that, and we did contribute at a pretty nominal level. We had hoped to be able to use it as the synergist to kick the door down. Our relationships with Patti are I think very mutually beneficial, and we're preparing to continue to go down that pathway. As we view these issues and the necessity of aligning understanding of international, federal, state, provincial authorities, certain legal concepts jump out at me. There's the Commerce Clause in a constitution, as this is relative to shipping safety. And OPA 90, for an example, we mentioned yesterday, is based on planning standards. And planning standards are, in my personal opinion, are a poor substitute for performance standards. Performance standards have a more direct correlation, traceable correlation to how the Coast Guard and industry can express to tribal governments that our treaty interests are being clearly addressed. So what that really means is, with OPA 90, it establishes the need to begin to develop that close working relationship with the shipping industry. We mentioned yesterday how when we went to Valdez to address the export through the Strait-of-Waututh into the Salish Sea, that it seemed very much like we were in the belly of the beast. Sometimes that's where you have to go. Intertanko comes to mind. Innocent Passage comes to mind. The Trump environmental rollbacks of so many regulations, clean water and NEPA. We have to develop the means to work together in a unified manner to address these issues. What we found the most effective was, as I mentioned yesterday, was to formalize these working relationships. And so, I appreciate this opportunity to speak to this panel. We're a potlatch society. That's how we represent our cultural and spiritual interests. I stand my name up when I speak as the head of our family. I would introduce my contributions by starting with a prayer song, a sika, and then by further expressing our family's position, there would be the possibility to put our dancers on the floor. One of our family songs that came from Canada, from Barney Williams and Edith Simons, along with our names. The name has guiding authority over the songs, and the dances belong to the songs. That's how we potlatch. That's how we. And then I stand my name up and I say who I am, so everybody knows that I'm telling the truth as I understand it. And if you have any questions about it, then you ask up the coast. Is Inuit telling the truth? Is he a stand-up guy? My Indian name is a whaling name that's been expressed to me to be at least 1,000 years old. It's the strength of spirit to keep the canoe and the harpoon throw straight. And these are the values, the cultural values that we convey to the Coast Guard. We had that opportunity to write into our latest version of our MOU with District 13, in order for them to understand the entirety of their trust responsibility to the Makah Tribal Council and the Makah tribe, they have to come to understand how our cultural identity is based on our spiritual values. And that's, to me, a very, very important development. Thank you very much for this opportunity to share.
Great. Thank you so much, Chad. For some reason, my video won't show, but I'm going to, it was disabled by my host. I'm going to turn it over to, there we go. I'm going to turn it over to Patti Gobin, who's just going to share a few closing words as we transition out. Thank you all for the Coast Salish Gathering, from the Coast Salish Gathering, for hearing our words today. Patti, are you available? There you are, my friend. There you are, sister. And Hillary, after Patti, the floor is back to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can,
hear you.
Patti.
Thank you. My English name is Patti Gobin, and I'm trying to get this unmute thing out of here. And my traditional name, my ancestral name is Squatoch. My traditional name comes from the Swinomish River system. I need to unmute.
We hear you, Patti.
Okay. It comes from the Snoqualmie and Snohomish and Skykomish River system. And it's the ancestral name of my great-great-grandmother. And so I am of Snohomish, Snoqualmie, Skykomish, and Upper Skagit descent. And I just want to tell you, thank you for everyone that has stayed and listened to this important work. I wanted to say that it's been an honor to listen to everyone. And thank you, Lami, for hosting this. And I especially want to thank Stephen Point for the words that he laid out and laid the platform for us to have the freedom and the good feelings to speak the way we're speaking. I'm going to cut this short because time is running out. And the thoughts that came to me is, number one, thank you for everyone that is working on the Salish Sea to protect it. This is our homeland, all of our homelands, not just the Coast Salish, but all of us that live here. The difference is that since time immemorial, this has been home to us. And I am the Salish Sea. My grandmother told me that, and I know that to be true. This is what I was feeling, that our voices have always been here. Our voices will still be here when others have left, moved away, changed their way of life, traveled someplace else. 200 years from now, my voice will still be here because it will go on through my grandchildren who will never leave this land. This is where we will always be as Coast Salish people. I look at it like this, 200 years and look where we're at. Our salmon, our whales, our sea life, habitat, fresh water, forest, rivers, human pressure, climate change, and now COVID. Look where we're at. It hasn't taken that long for us to be, we used to say last year and the year before, are we at the tipping point? We are at the tipping point. It's no longer are we, but we are there. And it's up to us to work together to ensure that for all of us, that we don't go beyond that tipping point. We start pulling that back. And so that's why we continue to kick at the darkness until it bleeds daylight. I wanted to read one last quote. And this quote was from my brother, Glenn, who's vice chairman of our tribe. And he testified at Roberts Bank when we were there. And it was heart-wrenching for him because it was his day to go clam digging with all his family and with my family. And I said, come on, brother, you can't get on your boat. You need to fight for Coast Salish. She says, I'm going. So we went, and it was not only a strong time, but a wonderful time for all of us, right, Dalton, to be together. But when he got up, he was so passionate. He said, and this applies to us. And I stepped off for a while to take another important meeting. And it was in regards to our mountains and what's happening to our mountains right now, and the threat to our treaty rights and our lifeways by the pressure that's being put on our mountains from recreation and other sources. And I always say now the biggest threat is recreation and vessel traffic. But it's how do we work together to ensure this with all of us together, Washington State, counties, cities, the province of Canada, all of us working together, First Nations and tribes. But Glenn said, we stand here today because we care. We care. He says, and he got mad, he says, we can't no longer continue to ignore what's happening around us. If we truly want the next generation to feel what we feel as we've grown up, there has to be something there. There has to be a way to address preserving what the Creator has given us. And that's what Stephen Point talked about. It was a gift given to us. We're all connected. And not by abusing it, by preserving it. And Billy Frank said one last thing. I thought about him. His words echo to me every single day. We are stronger together than we are apart. And so we all need to stay together. Even though this forum ends today, we need to continue on in the good work that we're all doing to ensure that there is a way of life for all of us. But specifically, you know, I never want to be greedy or selfish. That's a trait that's not good. But sometimes I feel greedy and selfish for my people, for my Coast Salish people, because there's no greater gift than to be a grandparent. I have 15 grandbabies that want to do the same thing I've done throughout my lifetime. So let's all continue working towards what we can do to protect the Salish Sea. And again, I'll end it with, I am the Salish Sea. The salt water runs through me. 60% of my body is water. And I believe that 60% of that is the Salish Sea. And so I thought about how many times we've said the Fraser River and what's going on with the Fraser. Well, when Stolo Nation had this spill, that leaches into the aquifer, which leaches into the Fraser River, and literally 60% of the fresh water coming into the Salish Sea is from the Fraser River. And our sockeye run that comes all the way down to Tulalip, because we have relations, and the salmon are no different than we as, there's no border for us as Coast Salish. Our bloodlines intermix all along the way, all on the coast. We're all interrelated, so are our salmon. And when they come back to Tulalip, our people depend on that along the way. And we've got many rivers along the way that are crying for us to be their voice. The Skagit, the Tsleil-Waututh, the Swinomish, the Columbia. These are our grandmothers. They're crying that bloodline that runs through those veins of those rivers that flow into the Salish Sea. There can be no compromise. We have to be diligent. And Ray, you're right. We will pick up more loads of kindling, more loads of wood, and bring it to the fire. We will be stronger together. One last thing from an elder that passed on. His name was Big Shot Cyrus James. He would come to every single dinner we had at Tulalip, every funeral we had, every celebration we had, and he'd always end it with, we've got to work together, my people. We've got to be strong like the cedar, kindling. If you take one piece of kindling and you snap it across your knee, it breaks every time. But if you take all the kindling and bundle it together and wrap it with cedar rope and try and break it across your knee, says it will never break. And that's how we need to be diligent in our work towards protecting the Salish Sea. And in Coast Salish, we say from white cap to white cap. Thank you, everyone, for being so patient, so kind, for having ears to hear, and for me, for having my own ears to hear. Thank you, thank you. Osiam.
Thank you, Patti. And thank you so much, Representative Lekanoff, for bringing together such an amazing panel. What an incredible breadth of experience and insight and wisdom. That was just wonderful. Thank you very, very much. Patti, I'm going to kind of echo your word of expressing how much of an honor it has been to spend the past couple of days with all of the amazing panelists and presenters, as well as all of you attendees. Thank you so much for spending, 2 chunks of 2 days with us through all of this. I hope everybody has learned a lot and is taking away a lot. I know that I am.